Marilyn Marks. I'm the Executive Director of Coalition for Good Governance. And I first want to thank Susan and Free Speech for People for hosting this event for us. We could have never pulled it together on our own. So thank you, Susan Greenhalgh, for doing that. We're going to get through this pretty fast today so that we can leave time, most of the time, for your questions. So I want to introduce the panelists super quickly and then get into just about 15 minutes of our telling you our overview and then go to your questions. So Susan Greenhalgh is our co-host here, and she is a expert consultant with us on this case, and her title is the Senior Advisor for Election Security at Free Speech for People. And as a consulting expert, she has done just great work for us. And then Distinguished Professor Philip Stark, who I think that everyone on this call knows that Philip is, or Dr. Stark is the expert on evidence-based elections and particularly post-election auditing. And so what he'll be talking about today, among other things, is what we need to do about this system breach. And I'm so proud to introduce you all to Bruce Brown, who is an Atlanta-based attorney who has been working with us on this case tirelessly since 2017. And he'll be here to answer your questions on the legal implications and ramifications as we go forward. Jean Dufort will be helping manage the questions, and Jean is a highly engaged, almost full-time volunteer for us, and she's a person we lean on so much for the work that we do. So thank you all for being here. But I'm just going to start out very quickly to say what we want to cover today beyond, of course, the questions you have are the most important things, but what actually was accessed in Coffee County and who accessed it? How did they gain that access? What were their goals? And then why does it matter what they did? The way I look at it is, while we've heard a lot about system breaches over the years, we've never seen a voting system heist of this extent, kind of an end-to-end type of stealing of the equipment. Let me see if I can show you a picture. Can you all see a picture of somebody putting a ballot into a scanner? I hope that my screen share works. Is that what we're seeing? No.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So the people who went into Coffee County, they imaged the touchscreen machines. They imaged the printer that's part of the BMD setup. They imaged the server, and that's all precinct-based equipment. They imaged the poll pads, which are the iPads used for check-in. They imaged the large-scale scanner that does the mail ballots, and the server, which is just the brains of the system. And so they got really end-to-end software and voting system data from the 2020 election and the January 2021 election. While, of course, we're concerned about the voting system data from those elections, we're really concerned about the fact that they got all of Georgia's software for the voting system. And that's what I think has been missed in some of the reporting, is that it is the implication to the future elections that is so concerning to us when we think about what was actually accessed, then put up on a share file account, where the credentials for that share file account were shared among many people. We don't know how many people. We know quite a few, and many of those who did receive the downloads of the system software and all of the data are people who are being investigated now in other states on criminal charges of tampering with voting systems and accessing voting systems inappropriately. How did they gain access? Through the local Coffee County leaders. I say leaders, the election director one of the election board members and the person who you've heard the most about in many of the news reports, and that's Kathy Latham, who was the chair of the Coffee County GOP. And she was also one of the electors, now called fake electors for Trump, very tied into the Trump campaign. And I think what you have seen on the news a lot is the contrast of her testimony in our deposition that that Bruce Brown helped take, and then what she told us in her deposition versus what the video evidence is showing. I just want to take a minute to direct you to one of the exhibits that has been filed in the case. I guess it was Monday night, that makes that contrast. And I think that for those of you who are writing this story, you will find that maybe using some of this contrast between her testimony and the pictures will grab the interest of your readers. But for example, this is, by the way, Exhibit 9. It is linked into the entire filing for Monday night was linked into your announcement for today's meeting. If you look at Exhibit 9 and go through it on your own, because there are too much to go through here. But for example, Kathy swore under oath that she had taught school all day and was at the high school, yet the video surveillance shows that she had come in at 11:37, left for a while, and was there basically most of the day. There are a few others I just thought I would point to here. Scott Hall, of course, is the person who left whose message I recorded when we were having a phone conversation some time ago. And he was the one who claimed that he had arranged all of this. Kathy was asked, did you see Scott Hall? She says, no, Scott came in from the outside. He and I talked outside. I was glad to have met him, and then I left. But here we see that at 4:30 in the afternoon, Scott Hall has his hands on Kathy's shoulders. Hardly I only met him and just quickly left. Here's another example. Did you see him, being Scott Hall, talk to Misty Hampton? No, I didn't see Misty. Here's Kathy standing beside Misty, who was talking to Scott Hall. So you can go through these, and I think you're going to find just alarming contrast in the testimony versus what the video shows. The video has been very hard to come by. We've been asking for it since March. We have gotten it in pieces, and I think we still have some teeth to pull to get some more video that we don't know what it will show. And we have not had the chance to go through all of the weeks of video that we did get over the weekend. So there's much more to learn, much more reporting to be done. But I want to turn to and have Susan and Philip talk about this. Why does it matter? What they actually were able to take away from Coffee County, which was the statewide voting system. Why does that matter, Susan?
Thank you so much, Marilyn. I just want to thank you for all the work that you and CGG have done, and emphasize that this information has come out because of the lawsuit that CGG has brought, which is incredibly important. This was filed in 2017, and like CGG, Free Speech for People disavows the ridiculous claims of the Stop the Steal and Big Lie people. And in fact, it is important to note that the only reason that we can understand exactly how the Stop the Steal people were involved in the breach in Coffee County, as well as Nevada and Michigan, is because of the discovery that has come about because of the curling lawsuit and the work that is done by CGG and its plaintiffs. They are exposing how the Stop the Steal people are actually making our elections less safe. As far as the incident in Coffee County goes, there's certain reasons why Georgia is particularly vulnerable, because they're more reliant on electronic voting machines to record the vote. I'm going to let Philip get into that in a little more detail, but I just want to emphasize that that means that there's an electronic device between the voter and their record of the vote, the ground truth of voter intent from which we derive our election results. And now you have an electronic device, which the software has been released on, or has been made public about. Not only do we have this problem in Georgia, there are other states that have the same less secure model, which includes all of South Carolina, the entire county, or the entire city of Philadelphia, the entire city of Los Angeles, many key counties in Texas. So this is a less secure model for voting in general, and it's now made even more insecure because of the release of the software that we've learned about in Coffee County. And just quickly, I want to point out that though there's been some muddying of the Secretary of State's investigation into this, there is a lot of information in the filings in the Curling case, from depositions from the Secretary of State's office, depositions from the people in Coffee County, which show that there were red flags, that there was something wrong going on in Coffee County over 20 months ago, and that the Secretary of State's office either ignored them or for some other reason did not pursue them. We have evidence from and this is an example. I'm not going to give you the entire timeline. If you want more, please contact me or Marilyn or some of the other people on this call. But in the spring of 2021, a business card for Doug Logan from Cyber Ninjas was found in Coffee County by the election director that replaced Misty Hampton, the one who was responsible for the breach. And that alarmed him. He reported it to the Secretary of State's office. The Secretary of State knew about that, supposedly began to look into it. There's no evidence of anything going forward. Furthermore, they found that the server password had apparently been changed in Coffee County in the spring of 2021. Secretary of State's office seized it, has no record of that, but didn't bother to try and find out why the password was changed. So these are the sorts of breadcrumbs that we've seen all along that should have triggered some sort of serious investigation, where instead in April of 2022, Gabe Sterling went before an audience at the Carter Center and denied that there had ever been a breach in Coffee County at all, which we have on video as well. So I'm just going to wrap there. There's a lot more on that part of the story. If you're interested in looking at it, please reach out to us, and I will turn it over to Philip to talk in more detail about the specific security issues. Thank you.
Great. So Georgia makes a big deal about having a paper record of the vote, but as Susan said, that paper record for virtually every in-person voter is generated by a computer, not generated by the voter themselves. That is that the paper printout of the votes is a record of what the machines did, not a record of what the voter did. These are the ballot marking devices that she referred to. This basically makes the paper trail itself untrustworthy. There have been several studies now, including one commissioned by the Georgia Secretary of State, that show that voters rarely check the paper printout to see whether it agrees with their intended selections. There's also research that shows that if there's a discrepancy between what they intended and what the paper shows, deliberately introduced by malware, they rarely notice and even more rarely report it. So the paper trail that's generated by these ballot marking devices is inherently untrustworthy. There are ways of running an election that is secure despite whatever might have gone wrong with the technology, despite the possibility of misconfigurations, hacks, bugs, et cetera, but it requires having a trustworthy paper trail. The paper trail itself really needs to be primarily hand-marked paper ballots, with exceptions for voters who have perhaps dexterity or vision issues that make it difficult or impossible to independently mark a paper ballot with a pen. The release of this software is even more serious than releasing source code would be. It is the actual installed software that has been compiled and built, has the associated compiled libraries there. In some instances may have, I don't know about Dominion specifically, but in the past, there have been examples of voting systems that had passwords embedded in the code or present in files. So by taking this software that they have illegally copied from various components of the voting system and installing it on commodity hardware, these voting systems mostly run on commodity computers, commodity scanners, commodity tablets, and so forth. they can basically build an exact replica of the system that they're trying to break into. They can stage any kind of attack. They can figure out what will work. They now have had far more access, far more time than the expert in this case on behalf of the curling experts, Alex Halderman, Professor Halderman from the University of Michigan had. So it's prudent cybersecurity to assume that a malicious opponent already has access to the code, that they know everything about the system. Georgia has adopted a security through obscurity model. They claim that their system is safe because nobody has had the kind of access that Alex Halderman did. Well, now many people have, an unknown number of people have, with unknown motives and unknown plans. So this is like bank robbers having an exact replica of the vault that they're trying to break into. They can try any number of things. Halderman's report shows that even a voter has enough physical access to the system to implant malware if that malware has been developed. So now there's enough information out there for sure, very widely spread, for other people to develop malware for these voting systems and potentially implant it. Even if advanced persistent threats like nation states, China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, already had examples of these voting systems, because you can buy them on eBay, as has already been demonstrated, many of these components. What this has done is really lowered the barrier to entry to people who would want to do ill. It's made this easily available to a large number of people, not all of whose motives might be the best. Moreover, it makes it more likely and easier to have disinformation attacks, a kind of attack, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, FUD attacks, because people can make claims about the software that might not necessarily be true. They could produce a version saying, look at this thing that's designed to flip votes that isn't in fact part of the real software. They could drum that up. So there's all kinds of mischief that people could do with this information, ranging from actual attacks to simply casting fear, uncertainty, and doubt on the outcome. There is a straightforward way to solve this problem. It involves a lot of shoe leather. First of all, Georgia, in its laws, has the option on an emergency basis of using hand-marked paper ballots in the polling place. The scanners can already tabulate votes from those hand-marked paper ballots. So it doesn't require a hardware change. In fact, it requires using less of the hardware that they already have, typically. So they could switch to hand-marked paper ballots. The second thing they need to do is to keep track of the ballots much better than they did in the 2020 election. This lawsuit isn't about the 2020 election, but what happened in 2020 is important to notice because it demonstrates that the way elections are being conducted in Georgia is just not careful enough. They are not keeping physical track of the ballots, of the memory cards, of the voting equipment, and so on. So if they generated a trustworthy paper trail and kept track of that paper trail, ensured that there was secure chain of custody, and then after they tabulate the votes using whatever technology they want to tabulate it, did a rigorous risk limiting audit of every contest on the ballot, they could produce convincing affirmative evidence that the reported winners really did win, and catch and correct errors in tabulation that resulted in the wrong person appearing to win, if that happened. This is within reach. Currently, Georgia's regulations only call for an audit of one contest every 2 years, selected by the Secretary of State's office. You can't borrow strength from that audit of one contest every once in a while to draw any conclusions at all about any other contests. So the pieces are in place. They just really need to be more careful about what they're doing and follow through. I'll shut up for now.
Thank you, Bruce. Would you cover a little bit of legal part for us? And I think one thing that I'm getting a lot of questions about is what's next? What other subpoenas, what other depositions are you planning to take?
Thanks, Marilyn. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. We are right in the middle of our discovery of the Coffee County incident. And there are a lot of additional witnesses that we are trying to subpoena, have scheduled. We have, in terms of what's actually on the schedule, we'll be taking the deposition of Robert Sinners on the 28th. Mr. Sinners is somehow implicated in Coffee County. We're not yet sure how, but he was the coordinator of the fake electors and also was an employee of the Trump campaign. In addition, we'll be taking the corporate deposition of the Secretary of State on October 4th, and that should give us a lot of information about the Secretary of State's as an office, as an institution, what they've been doing and what they haven't been doing. Other witnesses that we're trying to tag with subpoenas, it's not easy, include Jeff Lundberg, Scott Hall, Doug Logan for documents, Stephanie Lambert, Ed Voiles, Alex Cruz. All of those, I can answer specific questions about who they are and what their connection is, if those questions are out there. And so there are a number of additional depositions that we need to take. In addition, we're continuing to collect documents from people we've already subpoenaed. As Marilyn mentioned, with these document subpoenas, you have to go back and ask and keep on asking. That's how we got the video in the first place. It was about the 6th time we asked for it that we got the video. And even then didn't get it on. We don't think we even have all of it now. So it's a long process. We've been helped a great deal by the curling plaintiffs, as well as by a number of volunteers like Gene and others who have been instrumental in collecting information on this. I will leave the rest for questions on the different legal issues if we get there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Bruce. Yes, if you all have questions, I think the way we want to do this is to ask you to put those questions in the Q&A button, where Jean will then post those to the panelist that should answer them. And she's going to use some discretion based on, the number of questions we're getting and what we're getting the most of. Bruce, you mentioned that the curling plaintiffs, our co-plaintiffs in this, have been incredibly wonderful partners for us. And in fact, they have devoted unbelievable resources of the pro bono operations and Morrison Foerster. I think that their lead attorney, David Cross, gave the best overview of what happened in Coffee County and the implications in his status report to the court on the 9th of this month. And it went on for several minutes and had everybody who was watching just completely enthralled as he told the story. I encourage you, as you are writing your stories, to take a look at the transcript of the very powerful presentation that David Cross made to the court. I have posted it on my Twitter account on September the 10th at about 9:40. You will see the transcript, and my Twitter account is Marilyn R. Marks in the numeral 1, Marilyn R. Marks 1. That's a place to get that transcript. And again, I urge you to look at that as you were trying to get an overview of what really happened here. So, Jean, do we have a first question that you want to read to us?
We do not yet. We need to see. Hang on, something just got posted.
The reporters can also, if you want to raise your hand, we can take
I
questions.
I cannot see hand raise, but if you all can, that's great.
I think it should come up in the participants.
My gallery view is only showing me the panel.
We do have a question. Has Professor Stark provided testimony to the court equivalent to what he stated today? What is the current status of the lawsuit and what is a successful outcome? Is it likely? When is a decision likely?
I think I've almost all of it is either in a declaration or has been in live testimony before the court, with the exception of things like the metaphor or analogy to robbing a bank.
Right.
In terms of the status of the litigation, and Dr. Stark has provided this testimony because, our lawsuit was filed long before 2020. And so the fundamentals of what he has explained about election security are already in our case. And it's just the most recent episodes in the Coffee County that make it more of an emergency. In terms of the timing of the case, it's difficult to project exactly when the case is going to come for trial. Right now, we're trying to wrap up Coffee County and get our discovery done as soon as possible so we can get to trial and get some relief.
And that Coffee County is so important because, as we all keep saying, it is not an isolated instance that only impacts Coffee County. This is the statewide voting system that has great risk to, in fact, the November election. And that is one of the big concerns we have here, is that nothing is being done by the State Election Board, the Secretary of State, to address this danger to the November elections. Robert Preston, who runs Douglas Now, which is an online site, and it is the local news in Coffee County that everybody pays attention to. He has a very good question. He said, what do you think the motives were for the various players involved? Was it simply to find fraud in 2020, or are they looking to influence future elections? You know, of course, we don't really know what the motives were, but as Robert knows better than anybody, Coffee County is a big Trump county. And in fact, their audit of the first official results showed only a 1 vote difference. So there was no real question about whether Coffee County's results were valid. They came out almost exactly as expected. And so I don't think anybody thought that there was fraud or a problem with the machines in Coffee County so much. But instead, we believe that the motives of the people involved, they were attempting to look at the entire suite of software, how all of the equipment worked. Some of them were involved as well in contesting the election statewide. And it could be that they were looking for things that they could use as evidence of a system that they didn't like to try to use in those election contests. We don't know the motives, but I think we can all be pretty confident that nobody thought that Coffee County was wrongly decided.
Quick reminder, we've got a nice mix of working press and general public on this call. We're going to prioritize the working press folks' questions. If you can add the organization you work for to your question, that will facilitate that prioritization just a little bit.
And somebody asked about the GBI investigation and how serious that is. I want to say that we are so troubled about the fact that, as Susan said, as many times as the Secretary of State and the State Election Board had warning signs going back to the very beginning of right after this happened, that there was something that was really serious that had happened in terms of a breach in Coffee County. Nothing was done really until late this summer, when the Secretary of State finally called in the Georgia Bureau of Investigations, and they have begun interviews. But let's remember, and you will see in the documents, that in April, May of 2021, the new election director, James Barnes, finds out that he cannot get into the server, the brains of the voting system, because the password doesn't work. He calls the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State cannot reportedly get into it, even after coming down and attempting it. They merely exchange the server, leave absolutely no paperwork, no paper trail at all that this has been done. And at that point, with somebody having made an unsanctioned password change, they knew at that point that the system had been compromised for somebody to make an unsanctioned password change and did nothing.
On top of you, Marilyn, my understanding is that only the Secretary of State is supposed to have the IT privileges to be able to change the password. So the fact that somebody else was able to change the password is itself of concern.
Thank you. We've got a question from Mark Nisi from the HAC. He's asking, can we quantify the risk to the Georgia election system? CISA has reported that the vulnerabilities exist, but how likely is it that they could be exploited in a live election? And this is coming because of statements from the Secretary of State saying it's nearly impossible to exploit in a real world environment. Who wants to take that?
Philip, that one's yours.
Yeah, so putting a number on it, I won't pretend to be able to do, but the Secretary of State, the state's rebuttal of this relies exactly on the idea that nobody has physical access to these systems. And this Coffee County breach demonstrates that just isn't true. People have extended unauthorized access to these systems. So the basic assumption that they're using, that somehow security through obscurity and limiting physical access is going to solve their problem, is just false. Moreover, on top of the risk of actual manipulation is the risk of these casting fear, uncertainty, and doubt on the results by just generating a lot of smoke and noise. So I think the risks, the risks that someone is going to claim there's a problem are probably quite high. The risk that somebody will in fact try to hack the equipment, I have no idea what people's motives are. I won't attempt to quantify that. But the release of this installed code base, these images of the voting systems in Georgia, in Michigan, and in Colorado have really, again, lowered the bar to entry to anyone who would want to hack the system, because they don't have to go about acquiring things on their own. They're now out there. They could download them from the internet to get the blueprint from which they can make a working replica. So this has definitely made it substantially easier. Again, there's a relatively straightforward way to solve the problem, which is switch from using ballot marking devices for most in-person voters to using hand-marked paper ballots for those who can. Keep track of the ballots and other election materials much better than Georgia currently does, and then audit every contest. That lets you make an end run around the vulnerable technology, so that if there's malware, if there's bugs, if it's misconfigured, you still have a large chance of catching and correcting wrong outcomes before they become final and certified.
Thank you,
Thank
Phil.
you so
I'm
much.
reminded of Dr. Haldeman explaining to Judge Totenberg several years ago to think of the elections as a giant ecosystem where a huge amount of equipment has to move from storeroom to place. An enormous amount of people have to have incidental contact with it. So the idea of protecting it from human contact is a very difficult proposition. We've got a follow-up question from Kate Brumbeck of the AP. How would somebody be able to use the access that has been gained? What degree of physical access would you have to have, or could you do something remotely?
So per Alex Halderman's report, if someone had the kind of access that he had, or that these people in Coffee County have, and those who have subsequently had access to the software that was taken from the Coffee County devices, they could develop malware. The physical access that's needed to implant the malware, Halderman's report says that even a voter has enough physical access to the equipment. But that's before you start worrying about insider threats like those that occurred in Coffee County. So certainly anybody who works in one of the local election offices has enough access to install malware, but even voters do once the malware has been developed.
And maintenance staff, et cetera. I mean, as we have early voting out for 3 weeks in Georgia, and the machines are out in libraries, gymnasiums, et cetera, there are just many opportunities accessible to many people. Philip, one thing that I think there's always a misunderstanding about, people assume that somehow if there is malware, that it would be immediately detected and there would be something done about it. Can you address those 2 points?
Malware can hide, and even beyond that, it can erase itself after it's done some damage, but more likely it would hide and lurk. Even things like checking hashes of the software are not a reliable way to do it because the device can be hacked in a way that it will return the correct hash regardless of what what you try to do. So it's an issue. Yeah. And moreover, those checks aren't done routinely. They weren't even done, evidently, they weren't even done on the server that was recovered from Coffee County by the Secretary of State's office.
I would just also like to add one thing to put a finer point on it. As Philip mentioned, that Dr. Alex Halderman's report, which is the expert security report in the Curling case, which was also reviewed and confirmed by the Department of Homeland Security, CISA, the vulnerabilities that he identified, found that the access a voter has to the ballot marking device was sufficient to implant the malware or do something nefarious. So just going back to the fact that it's the ballot marking device that the voter is interacting with, that computerized device, is where that particular vulnerability could be exploited. We're not talking about the tabulation equipment at that point, because when the voter interacts with the tabulator, it's generally under the supervision of a poll worker. I mean, of course, you can again have insider threats. There's other possibilities, but this issue of voter access that I think Kate was trying to get at would be particular to the ballot marking devices, and the fact that Georgia's model requires the voter to use a computerized device to make that record of their vote choice. They don't allow the voter to record the vote directly themselves with a pen, and that's increases the exposure.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions that are basically saying who can do something about this beyond the state election board or the Secretary of State ordering hand-marked paper ballots. Are there other remedies, whether through court or the Department of Justice, that could intervene quickly, I think is the intent of the questions.
Right, Bruce, Jonathan Raymond of 11 Alive asked, is it too late for a court order?
It may be too late for a court order, given the Supreme Court precedent that makes it very difficult for courts to address, ironically, to address election issues right around the time of an election when you need it. So that is a barrier to that we have tried to work around in getting court assistance. But the question embedded in the questioner really has identified the key places to get relief. First would be the state election board that has a new chairman. It definitely has, we believe it definitely has the power to fix this easily. The Secretary of State as well. The state legislature could change the law, but that wouldn't be until next year. We do not see, sadly, a clean federal role in this for a variety of reasons. So that leaves basically the federal court as the primary place for obtaining relief.
Yeah.
People are worried about what can they do in November if the state election board and the Secretary of State will not act. At your local county level, those county election boards certainly have the authority to say we will go to emergency balloting because of these known risks. And that should be explored with the counties. Also, I got some text messages this morning from a group of Republican activists who are now, interestingly, promoting absentee mail-in balloting because of these risks. And if you remember 2 years ago, we were seeing many Republican activists say, we don't like mail-in balloting, we don't like mail-in balloting. However, apparently now understanding these risks more, some are saying the only way that we should be voting if we can't have hand-marked paper ballots in the polls is to do mail-in balloting. So I think that's very interesting level of awareness that is beginning to grow across the state.
Right.
I just wanted to add that I think we've made this plain, but the lawsuit is a nonpartisan lawsuit, always has been. The supporters of our lawsuit in terms of donors and also just people who support us come from all parties. Our lawyers are members of all parties. And this is not, and we have received a lot of support from Republicans, from Libertarians, and from Democrats throughout this litigation, before and after the 2020 elections.
Bruce, this is probably best handled by you. Emma Brown from the Washington Post observes correctly that the case has been going on for a number of years. When discovery ends, what's next? What do we think will be the next big decision-making time for the judge?
After discovery, there'll be motions for summary judgment there that may be filed by both sides. If those are denied, then the case will be tried. In terms of the time frame for when that would happen, don't know. But I think we're getting closer. It has been going on for a while, but there's been two big stages in this case. As you may know, the first couple of years was our efforts to successful efforts to throw out the old DRE machines. Sadly, they were replaced by the Dominion BMDs, which didn't help as much as we had hoped. So the case is long, but it's actually two different cases.
Right. And we should recognize that this team and led by Bruce for CGG, we had a landmark decision victory to get rid of the paperless touchscreen machines in this case in 2019. And a court had never found before a voting system to be unconstitutional. We had the statewide voting system declared unconstitutional 2019. Unfortunately, they jumped out of the frying pan and into the fire despite all of the warnings. But that is what we are looking to repeat now with the BMD, with the challenge to BMDs.
Can I just jump in and clarify
Please.
one thing that Bruce said? He mentioned Dominion BMDs, but there's nothing special about Dominion here. It's BMDs that are the issue.
Right.
You don't want to put technology between the voter and the record of the vote.
Correct.
We've got a question, I think, that's asking for some clarification. A number of states that had confirmed insider breaches made a very public stance of swapping out hardware. And in Georgia, as Marilyn, you pointed out, the Secretary of State has swapped out just one piece of hardware where much more was touched. But can you clarify what is the role of changing out hardware versus what is the remaining problem for Georgia?
I'm going to call on Susan to answer that, if you don't mind, Susan, because you've been really watching what other states have done to try to address it and contrast what's going on here.
So swapping out the hardware is something that should be done, but it's not the only thing that should be done. It's not a magic wand that fixes the problems. You want to get rid of the equipment that may have possibly been tampered with or in some way manipulated, as Philip mentioned. If malware was implanted, there's no way to know definitively because it can hide. So that's why you need to get rid of the equipment. But you still have the overall problem that the software has been released into the wild to countless individuals who may have ill intent and who may be using it to figure out ways to manipulate an election. So that means that you need the fundamental security precautions, those under the foundational practices that are going to ensure that your election is sound, which is hand-marked paper ballots for most voters with accessible technology for voters that may need assistive devices. But if you are using hand-marked paper ballots, you make sure that those ballots are well secured and accounted for, and then that the tabulation results are audited in a robust way, and that all contests really should need to be audited. The solution stays the same as, and then I'm just going to repeat what Philip said before, the fact that the software is in the wild now makes it more urgent that those practices, which we've known for a while are what's going to ensure that our elections are reliable and secure, are very thoroughly and robustly implemented.
Right. And we want to again reinforce the difference between Michigan, Colorado, and Georgia, that the way that how they have responded was to say, we're going to take out of service the equipment that was directly handled by the intruders and replace it. But remember, they have hand-marked paper ballots and audits. In Georgia, We do not have that. Therefore, it doesn't really help to change out the equipment.
They
And
also, forgive me for
Phil,
jumping
please.
on top of you, they also have much better canvases, much better chain of custody checks and other things. So they have better accounting for election materials. And
Right.
that's absolutely crucial.
Right.
Marilyn, can you speak a bit, what exactly operationally is required for a county to switch to the emergency paper ballot system compared?
It is
to the
so much
standard
easier
system?
than the Secretary of State would imply. Emergency paper ballots are required for all precincts to have available. All election workers are trained on how to use it. And Jean, even as you know, you're a great example in your own county. You watched this happen when there was the system didn't work. It frequently happens in a power outage, problem with the machines, that the poll managers will switch to hand-marked paper ballots, which have to be there, emergency balloting, have to be there in quantity to change over immediately. And as Philip pointed out, when those ballots are scanned, the hand-marked paper ballots are scanned, the scanners in the precincts are already capable of scanning and tabulating those ballots. So all this really involves is scaling an operation that they're already prepared to do, and usually they are doing it on no notice at all. They wake up in the morning and there's a power outage. If the state election board or the Secretary of State would acknowledge that there is an emergency right now, that would give the polling places weeks and weeks to prepare for the issuance of hand-marked paper ballots.
So the ballots are
available.
already in the precincts, right? Because they're the same ones used for provisional voters, and Georgia code requires a certain supply to be there for emergency. So they're already there. You need bigger print runs. You need some more pens. That's the plus side. And on the minus side, you don't have to transport 90,000 pieces of electronic equipment.
Exactly right. You would
DMPs and
say
printers
transporting and
The
program
logic and accuracy. Yeah, it actually will save the jurisdictions time because they don't have to do logic and accuracy testing on as many of the ballot marking devices, just the accessible one.
Okay.
Right.
So
It
the
is a
claim that
simple
it's just too
solution.
hard, it doesn't stand up
Right.
very
Right.
well. Okay.
So I'm really hopeful that the press will really dig into the issue of why is this only now coming to the surface at this level, and with you know, this is the toughest way to do it, as Bruce could certainly attest, to have private plaintiffs have to use subpoena power and discovery efforts in the court to extract this information from third parties. These are not even the parties to the case. And I guess, Bruce, you can comment, getting this kind of information from third parties is a hurdle in itself.
It's very difficult. Many of these witnesses have a newfound respect for the Fifth Amendment. That's one barrier. Then there's just the logistical difficulties of tracking these people down and serving them. And I wanted to mention that all the people that I've mentioned and all the people that we've deposed so far, we're the only ones that are serving these people. The state in our lawsuit has the same power to the Secretary of State, has the same power to issue subpoenas. They've done none of it. We've done every bit of it. And it's very hard work. A number of the people that we're trying to subpoena are on the lam, and they're hard to find, making themselves hard to find. So it's
Right.
It's hard work.
When all along the state election board, who has the responsibility for investigations, they could have conducted these investigations, conducted interviews from the very beginning. And we know that they started a investigation in December 2020 and kept it going for 9 or 10 months. But they ended up just on Coffee County, after making numerous visits to Coffee County and having all of these alarming signs of a problem. The only thing that they charged Coffee County with was basically leaving the door unlocked to the room for the EMS server.
One thing I wanted to,
Yeah.
one thing I wanted to clarify is that the investigation that Marilyn is referring to wasn't an investigation, at least not explicitly, into the Coffee County theft. It was other issues that had arisen in Coffee County. But I did want to say one thing about the state investigation, and the press has picked up on this better now than it perhaps had before. But we have spoken to either the witnesses or the lawyers for just about everybody. We haven't been able to tag all of them with subpoenas, but until maybe a week, 10 days ago, not one of them had been contacted by the Secretary of State, the State Election Board, or the GBI, or the FBI. Not one of them. Not the people in Coffee County, not the people who actually did the software copying. None of the people involved had been talked to. And we asked them, you know, have you been contacted by anybody to investigate this from law enforcement? Crickets, nothing, absolutely nothing at all. We were the only ones that were pursuing it.
And I just want to also to put a finer point on the investigate that Bruce said, the investigation that Marilyn alluded to, the investigation in Coffee County was opened in part because the election director who facilitated the copying of the software in Coffee County had posted a video to YouTube in December of 2020, which made claims about the insecurity of the Dominion voting system. And it included, behind her, the password to the election management system was posted and visible in the video, which went viral. So the Secretary of State's office, according to their representations and the documentation around this part of the investigation, they were concerned about the password being published, but they took no action to do the most fundamental security practice, which is to go in and change the password at that point. I know I've gotten notifications in my email that there's been some breach somewhere and my password showed up on some dark web and I should go in and change all my passwords. So if they were aware of this, they did not change the password, did not do any investigation, did not ask any questions about it. And then several months later, when the new election director came in, he tried to use that password, found that the server would not let him in because someone had changed the password, someone who did not have authority, because we know for a fact that the Secretary of State's office is the only entity that should have the privileges to change the password. That in itself should set up tons of red flags. They, instead of doing an investigation at that point, we're talking spring of 2021, the Secretary of State's office just took the server back to Atlanta, knew they couldn't get into it, didn't seem too bothered by that fact, and replaced it in Coffee County. That raises so many questions about what was really going on here and why we don't have answers to.
Also, the video that we got through the civil litigation showed Doug Logan in Coffee County. Didn't the Secretary of State also have a so-called investigation back in 2021 about a business card of Doug Logan's?
Well, they never actually took any action on that, or at least they say that they didn't take any action on that. The state, the county election director notified the Secretary of State that they found Doug Logan's business card. I think Susan alluded to this, and nothing. In fact, Frances Watson, the chief investigator, asked that her investigator from Macon office go check it out, find out if they had access by cyber ninjas. And according to James Barnes, who was the election director, nothing ever happened on that. So there were many warning signs, and it is very strange that nothing was ever done. When the deposition of Gabe Sterling was being taken, he denied that there had been any type of imaging, copying, unauthorized access. We played the Scott Hall recording where Scott Hall said, hey, we brought in the people from Michigan and they imaged everything. Gabe was asked more questions about it and ultimately said, yeah, I think our investigators did look at that, but I don't remember what was found. And But he also said, if something like that were to have happened, now in response to Robert McGuire, Bruce's co-counsel on this, who was taking the deposition, he said, what if such a thing had happened, what would be needed? And Gabe Sterling, representing the Secretary's office, said mitigation would absolutely be needed. However, Secretary is not doing any mitigation. And so it seems that this has all caught the Secretary of State's office somewhat by surprise, but maybe not all of it's a surprise, but for whatever the reasons, it just has not been thoroughly investigated, and more seriously, it has not been mitigated in any way.
Okay. We have not had any fresh questions in a few minutes, so unless anybody's
So Jean, then I'll take a privilege just to add something more to what Marilyn said, to give a little more points in the timeline. After Gabe Sterling's testimony, deposition, in which he heard an audio recording of a man who had made this allegation of copying all the information in Coffee County, the Secretary of State's office in March said that they officially reopened, that was the term they used in their court filing, reopened the investigation into Coffee County. That was March 2022 of this year. A month later, Gabe Sterling was at the Carter Center and volunteered that there have been ridiculous allegations made about software breaches in Georgia, including one that somebody came into Coffee County, and that absolutely didn't happen. If you haven't seen that video, you can contact us and we can send it to you. It's on video. So we're seeing these very conflicting bits of information. One in February, we don't really know what's going on. In March, we're opening an investigation into it. And in April, we already know that nothing happened, although now the investigation is still going on. There's a lot that kind of needs to be elucidated by the Secretary as to what really happened.
Right. One thing I was going to add that I think would be helpful for the press to know, that the transcripts of many of these depositions have been made available by David Cross and Morrison Forster by publishing or putting them as exhibits in some of the filings that we've done. And so I think, and in full transcripts are there in many cases. So as you were researching this, seeing the exact words of the witnesses under oath, I think will be a very helpful reference. If you don't find those transcripts and need them, let us know and we can help point you to them. But it's an incredible reference tool when you're really researching what actually happened here.
Yeah. We've covered a lot of ground. It might be helpful to do a lightning round and have each of our panelists tell you one thing that they feel is most important to understand about this situation. Marilyn, do you want to lead off or do you want to finish?
Well, sure. I'll just reinforce my point that the most important thing to understand is the risk to the November and ongoing elections. And this is not about 2020, that this is a statewide problem, high level of risk, nothing's being done about it. And this really needs an outcry from the citizens because, Jean, as we pointed out, the solution is so easy.
I'll just reiterate my two favorite points. Using an electronic ballot marking device makes the risk higher just inherently, as Georgia does, as do many other important jurisdictions, although the vast majority of the country is voting on hand-marked paper ballots, which is a good thing. We still have to keep in mind that there are these other places, and that there is ample evidence that the Secretary of State's office really should have been taking this breach very, very seriously for more than a year, and there is also ample evidence that they have not.
I'll slightly contradict Marilyn in saying that what needs to happen is straightforward, but not necessarily easy, right? Georgia needs to figure out, first of all, they need to abandon the ballot marking devices for most voters so that we have a trustworthy paper trail in the first place. They then need to keep that safe and secure and keep track of it, which they currently don't do very well, at least some counties don't. And then they need to use it to check the outcome of every contest using a serious audit of the results, and something like a risk limiting audit. It's not rocket science, it's straightforward, but it is work, and it does involve changes to some procedures. In Georgia, they could be a lot more like some other states that do this much better. As both Marilyn and Susan said, these breaches exacerbate a risk that was already there. The solution is the same. Hand-marked paper ballots for most voters, keep track of the paper, serious canvass, ballot accounting, poll book reconciliation, eligibility checks, and things like that, and then a risk limiting audit of the results.
I don't have anything else to add. Just want to thank all the members of the press and the other participants for their time and attention to this issue. Thanks.
We absolutely do. And we are definitely available. Email us, call us, and we are happy to answer your questions and point you to other resource materials, because Bruce and Philip have made enormous amount of resources available and transparent, unlike many lawsuits, of course, because we are an organization that works on election transparency. We have tried to be as transparent as possible in all that is happening in this lawsuit. And we greatly appreciate your coverage of it and your attention today. And we look forward to keeping you informed as the next few chapters happen. And I'm quite sure that there are more chapters to come.
I'm just going to say we're out of time, but we have one raised hand. So I'm going to encourage that person to contact Marilyn or Bruce or Philip or myself or Jean. I put my email address in the chat if anyone wanted to contact me.
Okay, thanks everybody, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone.